In this presentation, we'll be looking at two news articles about social inequalities in Rio during the 2016 Olympics and seeing how they relate to the issues of class, race, and gender that Donna Goldstein analyzes in Laughter Out of Place. We'll argue that although the Rio Olympics were expected to bring greater prosperity and social equality to Rio, they ended up exacerbating the class hierarchies that Goldstein describes. In our first article, we see how urban development leading up to the Rio Games drove favela residents out of their homes and increased police crackdowns on the poor. Our second article shows how poor women continued to resort to sex work to escape poverty, but how police presence surrounding the Olympics drove down business for sex workers while giving them few other options for income.
To start, poverty, inequality, racism, and violence are all defining elements of Brazil's culture, and the inequalities that are seen throughout the country are deep divides of ideology and cultural history. Goldstein's ethnography, Laughter Out of Face, focuses on the contrast between Rio's affluent and poor population and how these demographics work within a system that has been in place for centuries. A little bit of background on Rio talks about systematic inequality that persists throughout time. Brazilian elites were created through the political economic system made by the Europeans during sugar production and organization of crop systems. Back during the time of colonization and European expansion, white elites created economic strongholds through sugar, coffee, and chocolate plantations. This was accompanied through slavery, and well into the 1800s, slavery was an established part of Brazilian society. Once slavery was abolished, the structure of society didn't seem to change much, as most blacks continued to live in low-income, impoverished areas, starting the hegemonic cycle of generational poverty. Rio is known as a city of contrasts, mainly because of the differences between the middle and upper classes and the lower domestic working class. Many of the upper class elites talk about how the domestic worker and the lower class has a natural aspect. Affluent whites in upper class society tend to blame the economy as an explanation used by the middle and upper classes on the continuity of poverty for most blacks. These classes come up with reasons as to why having the class divide of the poor is a necessary evil. They supply labor, labor is cheap, and technically they are giving jobs to those who wouldn't otherwise have jobs. In reality, however, the domestic worker is systematically oppressed, and the reality is that many of these upper class elites have a discomfort towards any ideas of racism and would refuse to not talk about it. These elements all bring together how Rio has established itself as a very divided demographic, and how the middle and upper classes tend to completely ignore the reality of racist ideals and ideologies that persist throughout their culture. Because our topic focuses on the 2016 Rio Olympics, our first article that we chose focused on the systematic injustices and inequalities throughout Rio as the 2016 Olympics were on. Hosting the Olympics is usually a good sign for developing nations, as they are able to use money that comes in from governments around the world to funnel it into more impoverished areas. However, Rio's bureaucracy and government tended to use that money towards the more elites, pushing it into their communities instead of putting it towards the impoverished areas and favelas that are all the way on the outskirts of Rio. Because of this flood of money into the white, rich, elite, affluent neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods tended to get focused on less and even were bulldozed as Olympic renovations started to occur. These low-income housing evictions happened across Rio and forced so many of the impoverished people out of what they could call their few homes and areas that they live in. In the article, it states, contracts for everything from stadium and train line construction to port renovations have funneled billions of dollars in taxpayer-subsidized revenues to a handful of Brazil's most popular, well-connected families and their companies. Overall, this article about the 2016 Olympics shows that the city's problems are much larger than just the affluent neighborhoods not respecting the impoverished people, and it quotes that the city's problems reflect decades, if not centuries, of neglect for its poorest citizens.
Hiding or pushing out the unseemly residences of the poor has historical precedent in Brazil. In 1920, Rio prepared for the visit of the King and Queen of Belgium by hiding certain aspects of the city with urban planning that, as Goldstein writes, reinforced the physical separation of the privileged and non-privileged classes. Goldstein argues that this event shows Brazil's shame in its colonial mixed-race identity. By hiding the signs of poverty and racial inequality, Rio was able to legitimize itself as a prosperous, European-style capital on the model of Paris. The motivations behind the pre-Olympic preparations seem to have been pretty similar. Rio wanted to present itself as a world capital, able to compete with the other cities that have hosted the Olympics. It wanted to impress an international audience with luxurious accommodations and a beautiful city center. And it wanted to hide the shame of racial and class inequality that was evident in the favelas. But in hiding its shame, Brazil also increased the oppression of the poor and the class divide, with money funneling into the pockets of the rich and the poor being criminalized and forcibly evicted. There was an expectation that the development of the city and the economic boost that Rio would get from the 2016 Olympics would work its way down to the lower classes, but the economic structures and systems of political bribery funneled the money into the pockets of the rich. When money and time ran short, Rio's Olympics preparations reverted to the system of police brutality and crackdowns on poorer residents that were already in place. Paez's agency in solving the city's problems was compromised by a system of political financing and the complex structure of inequality that Goldstein describes as preventing the extension of the rule of law or liberal democracy to the favelas. As the article says, 8 years under a different mayor would not have fundamentally transformed a divided city, even if that mayor had managed to put an end to the give and take between campaign donors and public servants.
In this article, How Selling Sex in Rio Survived the Olympics and the Bad Times and Prospered by Amanda Delizio and Michael Silk, the idea of gender relations begins with how the country began to focus on the export of raw material commodities, which involved getting ready to host a greater number of people for the big sporting event, the Olympics. Brazil's economy was negatively affected as a result. They did not realize the need for a sustainable economy as the craziness of the Olympics began to distract them. Businesses, both sex-related and not, automatically assumed that they would all thrive because of the number of foreign people coming in. Their mentality was that the more people there were, the more money gone towards their businesses. The influx of people from foreign countries during Brazil's Olympics led to a reform on Rio's sex workers. Businesses began to realize that their high expectations were not met, and this led to individuals, specifically women, seeking something greater. The goal of financial security and social stability led them to pursue sex work because it seemed like the best means of survival. Women began to dream of seducing upper-class males in order to move up the social ladder, as they believed that these men could drastically change their lives for the better. They did all they could to support their families financially during this rough season, so if it meant taking part in sex work, then they would invest their lives into it if it led to some sort of financial stability. Therefore, this all connected to the myth of how the Olympics were good for business. This was portrayed through the bankruptcy of sex-related business, as the majority of the country's money went towards the so-called tourist fund, which caused fury within those who were financially struggling, and it led them to search for other means of work in order to survive.
Gender relations. So the Creole lifestyle is one of the gender differences that we've come across in the ethnography. So this lifestyle is what most women want to immerse themselves into, as it's more luxurious and safe. The coroa is representative of a crown, which is more often associated with the upper-class male society that exists in Brazil. These are the rich, light-skinned men that most women dream to be with, as their main attraction is the financial stability they can provide and the fact that they are now part of the upper echelon of Brazil's society. The next gender difference we see is during the consumption metaphor. So the consumption metaphor is defined as one who is either the consumer or one who is being consumed. In Brazil, women expect men to be the providers and bring in the main necessities such as money. They are supposed to be the ones that make a living for the family and are responsible for the family's survival. So this expectation is something that we see brings a difference between the status of men and women. Goldstein also says on page 126 that pragmatic calculations of wealth certainly influence the survivalist sexual strategies of low-income women and give the real economic and social status of whiteness it too figures as one variable that is considered in evaluating a potential partnership. This just goes to show that women don't have the means to provide for their families, as they don't occupy jobs that supply them with a significant amount of money, further reinforcing the male dominance in their society. So, one of the few places women receive work is through sex work. Due to the Kuro system, women feel like sex work is really the only way they can survive in Brazil's society, as women are not paid equal to men and need to find some way to make a living. The Kuro men are a great means of financial support, as they are part of the upper class and can pay the women a decent amount of money. Even today, the class divide is so wide that sex work is seen as the only viable economic option, and gender relations are fundamental to culture through today. And without the institutional and juridical mechanisms available in the middle and upper classes, poor women are left as the guardians against a socially constructed transgressive male society.
As we talked about throughout our presentation, both news articles we've chosen to focus on bring to light systematic issues within Rio. Goldstein's ethnography emphasizes the pervasiveness of both systematic injustice and gender inequalities in Rio, which were exacerbated by the 2016 Olympics and the news that followed. The big issue that we have to continue to focus on within Rio is the issue of systematic racism and the question of if it's an issue that the government should focus on fixing, or if it's something that must be changed within the mindsets of Rio's youth and society in general. Ideologies like colorblind erotic democracies help to perpetuate the separation of classes and the poverty that ensues. And we see through the reality of where funding went in the Olympics that Rio's government is more focused on keeping its elite class as rich as possible instead of focusing on lifting the 99% of the population that lives outside those lines.